Gail, I just want to thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to share some things I hope that you'll find is exciting and helpful. Let me see here just one second. If you have that HDMI cord, we'll plug that in. Just out of curiosity, how many of you are somewhat familiar with the research that I've been involved with involving the evidences of the Book of Mormon? How many of you are not familiar with that? Not familiar with my research? Oh, good. Then most of you already know somewhat about it. That way we can move on to, I'm going to blow through a bunch of it then, so we don't have to take time. Because if we get to the end, if I can get done fast enough, then I have a video that we made well, it's actually been about 4 years ago. It's still apropos, it's just that there's a little bit of dating to it, but it's pretty exciting. So actually, as I've listened to all the different speakers today, I've just been amazed with with how many different times the things that I'm wanting to share with you have come up. All right, so I'm going to just blow through some things. Because what I'd like to do today is kind of wrap a bunch of different things together that I think you'll find is interesting, and it involves why America is important. And is America important? And if so, why is it important? So one of the first questions that I want to just briefly touch on is where is the first recorded instance of a land of promise in any of the standard works? Now, this is going to have a bit of an LDS slant to it. So if you're not LDS, hang in there with us, though, because this also applies pretty much just equally with Christians as well. But the bottom line is that, so where's this first land of promise? Well, actually, it's not in the Old Testament, which you'd normally think it would be. It's actually in, for those of us who are LDS, it's in the Pearl of Great Price. And in the Pearl of Great Price, we talk about, most of us pretty much know they're LDS, that the teaching is that the Garden of Eden was where? In Missouri, okay? That so Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden when they were expelled, and they would have found themselves in what today is the heartland of America. And if you take a look here in the Pearl of Great Price and Moses, it says that Enos, he's the grandson of Adam, he lived 90 years and he begat Canaan. And it says that Enos and the residue of the people of God came out of the land of Canaan and dwelt in a land of promise, which he named after his own son by the name of Canaan. So the original land of promise was named after Adam's great-grandson Canaan. And where was this land of promise? Do we have any ideas? Well, for those of us who are LDS, where was this land of promise? There's a clue in section 107, verse 53 in the Doctrine and Covenants, which says that 3 years before his death, Adam called all of his righteous posterity together at a place called Adam-on-Diamond. Now, how old was Adam at this time, if it was 3 years before his death? Well, supposedly he lived to 930 years old, so they'd been about 927 years old by the time this happened. And so he called his family to the valley of Adam-on-Diamond. Now, how many of you have heard of where Adam-on-Diamond is located? Okay, we all kind of know where that is located. But those of you who are looking for a sign, there's your sign. Over there. All right. So there you go. So I got Adam-on-Diamond. This is where it's located. It's in Daviess County, Missouri. And the reason why we know that, this is the valley of Adam-on-Diamond, if you want to take a look at that. But the reason why we know about this from an LDS perspective is because of Doctrine and Covenants section 116, wherein the Lord told Joseph Smith that Spring Hill is named by the Lord Adam-on-Diamond, and Spring Hill is in Daviess County, Missouri. So if that's the case, then it appears that Adam and his posterity never really left the area around the heartland of America, which means that was the original promised land. Now that promise, what was the promise? The promise was basically this: as long as they are righteous, they get to stay on that land. But if the day ever comes when their posterity becomes so unrighteous that they pass a certain threshold, apparently, then what's going to happen? They get the broom treatment. They get swept off the land, right? And so we follow Adam's posterity down through, in the Old Testament, down to there's Canaan here, and then we get down to this prophet here by the name of Noah. And at this point in time, Adam's posterity had become sufficiently wicked that the Lord basically said, it's time. You know, the broom's coming out, the floodwaters are coming up, And so we know what happened basically with the Noachian flood. The earth was completely and utterly flooded. And Noah, which is kind of an interesting aspect, where did Noah build the ark then? The ark was made in America. If you think about that, that's kind of an interesting thing. The ark was made here in America, and the Book of Mormon actually says when the floodwaters receded from out the face of this land, it became a choice land and a promised land, right? So this promise was actually on the land itself. It's interesting. There's an interesting part of that. So we have the Noachian flood, the great deluge, and if you're interested in information about how this may have happened, the mechanisms and so forth, and the overwhelming evidences that there was in fact a global, worldwide flood, I suggest you get a hold of a copy of the Universal Model, which just came out about a year ago. I had the privilege of being a senior scientific researcher on that project for 7 years, and it's a about 2,400-page scientific textbook. The first volume of which is about 800 pages, and that's the first one that's out right now. The second volume is actually out just online. But anyway, so that's not what we're here to talk about today. That would be another fun time about when we have about 3 days to talk about that. Okay, but anyway, so Noah and his family, they ended up landing in the mountains of Ararat, according to biblical sources. From there, he and his 3 sons spread out across the land. You have Japheth, which occupied the northern area. You have Ham, who was married to Egyptus here in the southern portion over here in Egypt area. And you had Shem, took over basically the Saudi Arabian peninsula. And so they were all there, spread out. And then we get down to, as you go down through, down through the history from Shem, one of Shem's lineage was a prophet by the name of Abraham. And Abraham we know about this time that happened with Abraham, wherein he was as a child, he was going to be offered to idol gods, and so he left, and then ultimately we have a situation where he is then ironically asked to sacrifice his own son, but for a proper God. So because of his unflinching righteousness and willingness to actually obey God no matter what, he was given specific blessings. Now, do places matter? Does it matter where things happen? Does it matter where God the Father and the Son appeared to a young man in New York? Does it matter where things happen? And in this particular case, it matters a lot, because anybody know where this happened? What is the physical location where this happened? It's called Mount Moriah, where this occurred. And today, where is Mount Moriah? Well, it's right here. Basically, it's the Dome of the Rock area in Jerusalem. And it's interesting, as I was over there just a couple of years ago, and one of the things that struck me is you have the Muslims, the Jews, and the Christians, and all of them are willing to basically fight and die over this place. And as I looked around, I was going, why? What's there in this forsaken place? I mean, it's not really beautiful. It has no natural resources to speak of. It's not really, I mean, it's somewhat strategically located, but not really critically important. So what is it about this place that people are willing to fight and die for? Why would these three the most, one of the largest religions on the earth actually would be willing to fight and die over who gets to own that piece of real estate? Why? Well, it actually turns out because of each one of those groups, the Muslims, the Christians, and the Jews, each one of them want to be partakers in some special blessings involved with a covenant that God made with Abraham and all of his posterity. What was exactly this covenant that God made with Abraham? There's 4 parts of it. First part is the land itself, the real estate that was involved with that. According to Abraham, it says that the land of the Canaanites, unto thy seed will I give this land. In Genesis chapter 13, verses 14 and 15, it says, lift up thine eyes, Abraham, and look from the place where thou art to the north, the south, east, and west. As far as your eyes can see, to thee will I give this land unto thy seed for how long? You read that? Forever. And how long is forever? It's a long time, right? Okay, so this land is now forever. What's interesting is the covenant, this part of the covenant is actually not with the people that live on the land, it's on the real estate itself. It's on the land. Whether the people are there or not depends upon their righteousness. And so we have basically two promised lands. The first one from Adam and Eve and their posterity over here called Canaan, and the second one over here with Abraham and his posterity here called Canaan. Let's go over the other aspects of this covenant. Number 2 of this covenant is the blessing of posterity. We just had a couple of wonderful presentations about how important posterity is. It's one of the greatest blessings that God can give to us as human beings. It's how the human experience happens. It's how God manifests himself through humans, right? It's interesting that he put the very first commandment given to mankind was to multiply and replenish the earth. And today there are people who really believe that a child is just a carbon footprint that uses up resources. Look how far we've come. So this posterity was going to be blessed. In fact, the Lord specifically said, he says, I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth. If a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. God apparently looked at this as one of the greatest blessings he can give, is the blessings of posterity. And here's a few of Abraham's posterity right there. All right. This is the third one. I want you to take a guess what this one is. What is this blessing? This is the third blessing associated with the covenant. It says, then I will give you rain in due season, and the land shall yield her increase. The trees of the field shall yield their fruit. What kind of blessings are these? They're blessings of prosperity. In fact, the Lord said specifically that your flocks and herds are going to increase, and your trees and your vineyards and so forth. We're all going to do very well. God is going to bless these people on this covenant land. Okay? The covenant people. And the last one he's going to talk about is security, protection. Here in Leviticus it says that nobody's going to make you afraid. There's going to be peace in the land. Going to get rid of all the evil beasts out of the land. The sword's not going to go through your land. And in fact, 100 of you should put 10,000 to flight. And your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. Basically, it's like this. God says, you be righteous, and I will fight your battles for you. I will protect and defend you. Why? Brings us to an interesting question. Why would the Lord bless these particular covenant people while they're on this promised land with these 4 blessings of the land, posterity, prosperity, and security? Why was he going to give them those blessings and not everyone? Does God love some of his children more than others? Well, of course he doesn't. He's impartial, right, when it comes to that. But that doesn't change the fact that he is going to give these particular people some blessings that not everyone has the opportunity and privilege of receiving. Why? Why would that be the case? Well, it actually has to do here with Genesis chapter 22. The Lord actually told Abraham that he is to use those special blessings to do something very important. He says, in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And specifically said even with the blessings of the gospel, which are the blessings of life eternal. So basically he said, I'm going to bless you with these blessings, but in return, I need you to do something for me. I need you to bless all of my other children on the earth. And it's going to happen through this promised land. Okay, so that's a little bit about that. So going back to the Abraham, you have Abraham here who has Isaac, who has Jacob. And Jacob has how many sons? I'm going through this world history thing here so you can see how these 2 promised lands have affected all of the history of mankind and humanity and where we're at today on one of those promised lands. Okay, so Jacob has 12 sons. They take the land of Canaan, they divide it into 12 parts, each one receiving an inheritance. Unfortunately, they can't get along for too long. A few centuries or a few generations later, they split into the northern tribes and the southern tribes. 10 form an alliance in the north, 2 form an alliance in the south. They are bumping along here and pretty much living the commandments, but then they start to fall away. They start to forget about the sacred covenant that God made with Abraham and the blessings that are associated with it, but also the responsibilities associated with receiving of those blessings. And so they begin to fall into apostasy, and they start to forget about their responsibilities. Well, what happens? So the Lord revokes his covenant of security, and he allows an incursion, an attack by the Assyrians at 722 BC, in which the it made major, major problems. Okay, they tore down houses and they had major destruction, but luckily they were able to actually overthrow the Assyrians and drive them back out of their lands before they were completely conquered. And Isaiah writes about this just a few years after the fact, after this happened. And he writes in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 10. And way that you can remember that, just remember Isaiah 9, 10, and 11. So if you remember 9:11, it's one way to kind of remember this. All right, but he says, Isaiah records, he says, the bricks are fallen down, which was their primary building material. But we will build with hewn stones. Of course, a hewn stone is better than a brick, right? He says that this is the attitude of the Israelites after having barely survived the attack of the Assyrians. It says the sycamores are cut down, which are the sycamores are the natural trees in the area. It says, but I will change them into cedars. Well, a cedar tree is a better tree, but it's not the tree God gave them to work with. So they're going to have to import. It's an import. The attitude of the Israelites was this. When we were attacked, we are going to be defiant. We are going to show the world that we are Israel and we are awesome, and we're not going to be put down, and we're going to show the world how great we are. Not once thinking about this covenant, humbling themselves and asking for God's protection. So what happened? A few years after that, the Assyrians came back, and this time they came back with a vengeance. And this time it didn't go so well for the northern tribes. They were completely and utterly destroyed and driven off of those covenant lands. They were driven off into the north country. Some of them went up into what is today Russia and that area. Some of them went up into Europe and then that area. We don't know where some of them went. We know that when they returned, big things happened. The ice is going to flow down at their presence. There will be a highway cast up in the midst of the great deep, and all kinds of things like that happen. But the bottom line is that here we have the northern tribes of Israel are now off of the covenant land. Is the land still a covenant land? Is it still under the covenant? Yeah, the land is still there because guess what? It's still today a place for the gathering of the house of Israel. Okay, but the southern tribes, they're hanging in there, but just a little bit longer until we get down to a guy by the name of Lehi, a prophet who was told in advance by God in a vision that Jerusalem was about to be destroyed. Now, there were other prophets in the time frame that weren't there in Jerusalem, but they were prophesying the same thing. You have Daniel and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. They were all in other places, but they were all prophesying the downfall of Jerusalem. But nobody believed in Jerusalem. Why? Because they knew that he had this covenant that was supposed to protect them as long as they're righteous. They didn't follow up with the righteous part. They became unrighteous. So this prophet by the name of Lehi is commanded to leave the area, and he's directed to leave Jerusalem. Of course, we know that about 586 BC, the Babylonians this time come up and they attack this is actually the third time they've attacked the southern tribes, the area around Jerusalem, and they destroy Jerusalem, and those who were unfortunate enough to live were hauled back as slaves to Babylon. See, the Babylonians weren't really known to treat their slaves very well, so it was a pretty dramatic thing. So now, how many covenant people are on the promised land? None of them. Is it still a promised land? Yeah, it will turn out to be. All right, so this is just showing the captivity routes and so forth here. Lehi leaves, and according to the Book of Mormon now, he goes down along the Red Sea. He goes over onto the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. They build a ship, and they sail it to America. This is a 2-hour presentation just about this part here, but this is actually, by the way, this ship right here, this is actually a 600 BC replica ship that was built in 2009 in Awad, Syria. It has actually verified Lehi's ocean voyage. It is no longer a question of whether or not Lehi could do it. This is actually something that's been proven beyond any doubt in a 600 BC replica ship by a whole bunch of awesome non-Mormons. All right, so we won't go into all the details about that. It would be fun, but we just don't have time. But when Lehi arrived on this promised land, he said something very interesting. He says, notwithstanding our afflictions, we have obtained a land of promise, a land which is choice above all other lands, a land which the Lord God has made a covenant with me that should be the land for the inheritance of my seed. Apparently, Lehi is tying back into or re-invoking the covenant that had been made. Would it make some sense for God to bring Lehi and his family back to the original promised land previously occupied by Adam and Eve and their posterity? That covenant had never gone away, so it would be easy for him to come and actually receive the same blessings as long as they're willing to do what? Obey the, do the restrictions. And we'll talk about that. So how many promised lands are there, actually? Well, for that, I'm going to defer to the ultimate authority on the subject, and that's Christ himself. When he is with the Nephites in the Book of Mormon, he specifically said that there was 2 promised lands. He said, number 1, he says, I will remember the covenant which I made with my people. And I have covenanted with them that I would gather them together in my own due time and give unto them again the land of their inheritance, which is the land of Jerusalem, which is the promised land unto them forever. See, Christ also said that that promise is forever on this promised land. Okay? So this is a promised land of God. The covenant gathering place for the house of Israel also just happens to be where Christ initiated his ministry and brought forth his gospel. But then Christ, in the same chapter in the Book of Mormon, he said this. He said, behold, this people will I establish in this land, unto the fulfilling of the covenant which I made unto your father Jacob, and it, meaning this land, shall be a new Jerusalem. So we actually have 2 interesting things. We have Canaan and Canaan here. We have Jerusalem and New Jerusalem here. Does anybody see a pattern going on in these 2 places? What's interesting is if you take a look at the globe, they're almost exactly on the opposite sides of the earth. One's on one side, one's on the other side. And we'll get into that in just a second here when we talk about eclipses. So then we have the New Jerusalem is going to be, according to a revelation given to Joseph Smith in section 84 in the Doctrine and Covenants, it says that to stand on Mount Zion, which shall be the city of New Jerusalem, which city shall be built beginning at the temple lot in the western boundaries of the state of Missouri. So we know where that's going to be located. Missouri, USA is where the New Jerusalem is going to be built according to this prophecy. If Joseph Smith, if you're one of those like me who believe that Joseph Smith is a prophet, then that's a statement that is revelatory. All right, then if you continue on, I have a whole series of chain of scriptures that normally go along with this, but for brevity here, I cut this down to basically just saying, he said it was a chosen land and the land of liberty. In the Book of Mormon, the land that they were on, that the Book of Mormon people lived upon, they continually called it a land of liberty. In fact, 8 times they called it a land of liberty. Which is an interesting aspect. Is there any difference between freedom and liberty? It's just a little side note here. Are these 2 words synonymous with each other? Freedom and liberty, they mean the same thing? Okay, let me explain something that I think you'll find is very interesting. If you get nothing else except for this out of my little presentation here today, hopefully it'll be worth it. If you go to Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary, he defines freedom. It says, not being under necessity or restraint, either physical or moral. Freedom, basically, is the ability to do whatever you want. You can be as righteous as you want to be. You can be as wicked as you want to be. It's your choice. That's freedom. Okay? It says the state of exemption from the power or control of anybody else. But Noah Webster then, he said, liberty, on the other hand, is interesting. He said, liberty consists in the power of acting as one thinks fit without any restraint or control except for this one thing, the laws of nature. So it's freedom with the restraints placed by the laws of nature. What exactly is the laws of nature? Well, the law, it says here under the law, it says the law of nature is a rule of conduct arising out of the natural relations of human beings established by the Creator, established by God. That's where natural law comes from, the rules established by God. And that's what natural law is. And it's interesting, if you take a look at the final draft of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, it says that the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle us. And that's what is driving them. In fact, Patrick Henry, he said, millions of people armed in the holy cause of liberty are invincible by any force. Now, interestingly enough, how many times did the founding fathers of the United States refer to this nation as the land of freedom? No, we have looked, and we have not been able to find a single solitary instance of any founding father calling this the land of freedom. They always referred to it as the land of liberty, which means that we are free, but the restraints placed by God. We are under God's law. The best definition I think I've ever seen in this freedom and liberty thing actually comes from the Book of Mormon in 2 Nephi chapter 2, verse 27. It says, "Wherefore men are free to choose," they're free according to the flesh. They are free to choose, choice number one, liberty and eternal life through the great mediator of all men, or choice number two, to choose captivity and death. Either way, liberty is a choice. Liberty is the choice to follow God and His law. I find it absolutely astounding then that we have in the harbor in New York, we have this statue, and she's holding up a torch, and she's called the Statue of, and we have this bell in Philadelphia, and it's called the, right. And in the Book of Mormon, we have this interesting time where there's this guy by the name of Moroni, and he takes a standard, and he holds it up, and he called it the title of freedom, right? No, he called it the title of liberty. That we are saying loud and clear, we are under God's law. We submit ourselves to Him and His laws. In the Book of Mormon, it talks about that later on, after the Book of Mormon people are going to be, the Nephite people are going to be annihilated, basically, that it says that there would be people who came, Gentiles, who would come forth out of captivity. They're going to be lifted up by the power of God above all other nations upon the face of this land, which is choice above all other lands. It's going to be a nation among other nations. Now that nation is said it will never have a king. That nation was said to be, would one day become a mighty Gentile nation above all other nations. They said it would be a land of liberty. They said it would be a land of freedom and prosperity, okay, and security. They actually talked about all those things. These are the two land of promise. These are the two covenant lands. Interestingly enough, in the Book of Mormon, there was prophecies about this nation. It said that I, Nephi, beheld the Gentiles that had gone out of captivity were delivered by the power of God out of the hands of all other nations. Was there any indication that God played any kind of a role in this? Okay, and it says, it shall be a land of liberty unto them. It shall never be brought into captivity. Okay, woo, man, okay. Well, we're just going to, so there's a bunch of prophecies about the land. I'm not going to go into that. The only nation that fulfills every Book of Mormon requirement to be the promised land is the United States. And this is a quote by Elder L. Tom Perry. So this covenant that God made with Abraham, there's 4 parts of it. If you know what this is the preamble of the Constitution. And embedded in the preamble of the Constitution, or guess what, folks? It's every aspect of the covenant is there. The land, the posterity, prosperity, and security, it's all there. If you take that, was this document inspired? In fact, who was it that takes credit for it? The Lord is actually who takes credit for it in Doctrine and Covenants section 101, where he says that I established the constitution of this land by the hands of wise men whom I raised up for the very purpose. So what's the obligation associated with this covenant? It's to keep the commandments. How well are we doing as a nation today? If we are the promised land, how are we doing at keeping the commandments? Because you see, the commandments are the one thing that they have to do as a nation. They don't all have to be active in their churches or whatever, but as long as the nation itself is living the 10 Commandments, they receive all the blessings associated with the covenant. And let's get down to George Washington. So we have George Washington and his inauguration. From the historical sources, they got the Bible out. He put his left hand on Genesis chapter 49. He put his right arm to the square and invoked a covenant with God on this nation as its first rightful leader. Interestingly enough, this happened where? Washington, D.C.? Nope. Philadelphia? Nope. It was in New York. And the place where this actually happened is this church right here. It's called the St. Paul Cathedral. At the time when this was actually happened, when the invocation of the covenant with God on this nation happened, that cathedral owned about 4 or 5 acres of land right there. Now that land later on was then sold, and then sold again. I think it was the 3rd time it was purchased. If you take a look at the spire here, it's kind of unique. But if you take a look at this, the next buyer of this land, they decided they were going to develop it. But they weren't going to just develop it for any old reason. They were going to put the tallest building in New York. No. We're going to do better than that. We're going to build 2 matching buildings that look exactly alike, the 2 tallest buildings in New York, which is the icon of America to the rest of the world. And so they built the Twin Towers on the actual piece of property where the invocation of the covenant actually happened. So there's the Twin Towers, and you can see the tower of the steeple of the church here. Of course, we all know what happened on 9/11, right, when this happened. Interestingly to note, not one but both towers came down on the actual place where the invocation of the covenant happened. Okay? Interestingly enough, though, the church that was down at the bottom of this pile of rubble, when the North Tower came down, it actually caused a blast wave that blew out doors and walls and windows of buildings all around that church, but the church was basically unharmed. And they said, wow, that is really awesome how that happened. Remember how it said the bricks are falling down, but we will build with hewn stones? Sycamores are cut down. This was Isaiah prophecy. Turns out this is the plaza there in between the buildings here. If you take a look at that, those are pavers down here. The bricks. And they were, in fact, torn down. They decided to replace them, but they also there was big trees in the front of that church that actually caused the blast wave to come up and actually rip the trees out by the roots. And the bottom line is that these trees happened to be sycamore trees. They decided to replant some of the trees that had saved the church miraculously from being destroyed. And they brought in a huge 10-ton piece of granite from the Adirondack Mountains to use as a foundation stone for the new tower, which was going to be called what? The Freedom Tower. The Freedom Tower. The tower that says the new icon of America in our most populous city is going to be raised up, and the name is going to reflect that we will no longer be under God's law. We are free to choose, and we choose not to be. So they put this big stone down as the foundation stone. Unfortunately, it split, so they had to take it out. They also then took this tree and replaced one of the sycamore trees with this tree of hope. It happens to be a cedar tree. They literally replaced the sycamore with the cedar tree, just like the Isaiah prophecies. And then they planted it, but unfortunately, a year later, they had to dig it back up because the tree of hope died. It did, okay? Now, the last couple of things here, I've got the stop message here, so I've got to stop here. But bottom line, how many of you have ever heard of the Shemitah year, 7-year cycle years? Well, after 9/11 happened, then 7 years later, what happened? The stock market crash of 2008. How many of you lost money in the stock market crash of 2008? Okay, your money became slippery. Where did that money go? The Book of Mormon talks about how the money became slippery. Nobody could hold on to their money. Isn't that about a perfect description of what happened in the stock market crash of 2008, wherein the Dow dropped by 777 points? If you know what the number 7 is in Hebrew symbolism, and that is the symbol for judgment. 777 is judgment, judgment, judgment. Then everybody thought, well, 7 years later, in 2015, big things are going to happen. The prepper industry went crazy. People are buying stuff. They're getting ready for this massive crash. 2015 came and went, not even a whimper. What's wrong? What happened? How come nothing happened? It's a 7-year cycle. Well, you see, you have to understand one last couple of things. I'm really going to, okay? You're going to kill me. All right, but basically, these 4 parts of the blessing, scripturally speaking, when people, the covenant people of God, reject God, guess what happens? God has to withdraw those blessings. And scripturally speaking, he always does it in reverse order. So the first thing that he's going to remove from them is the blessing of the covenant of security. The second thing, if they don't listen to him, he's going to take them with he's taken away the blessing of prosperity. The third thing is posterity, and if they still will not listen and turn their hearts back to God, then he's going to go to the big one, which is swept off the land. So in 2015, what happened? Everybody thought nothing happened. But brothers and sisters, I don't know if that's right to say that here. Anyway, but the bottom line, well, we're all brothers and sisters, right? Bottom line, what happened in 2015? We have, for the first time, our Supreme Court rules that same-sex marriages are now legal in all 50 states. Same-sex marriages cannot produce children, right? Not only that, but then the vote is to defund Planned Parenthood fails. And Planned Parenthood is then given money for the next 10 years, so another 60 to 70 million children will never see the light of day or take their first breath. Covenant. Usually in previous dispensations, the revocation of the blessing of posterity has involved wars and people die. In this case, the Lord doesn't even need to bring in somebody else. We're killing our own kids. U.S. fertility rate now is at the lowest point since records began being recorded in 1909. That was in 2016. 2017 is worse. America's birth rate is now a national emergency. Love to talk about some of that. U.S. fertility rate reaches a record low. Solar eclipses that happen. We already had one that just happened that crisscrossed the United States, the covenant land of God. There's another one that's going to be coming up here in 2014 that goes the other direction. When these happen, if you look back at this right here, that's the moon's shadow on the earth. So in that case, both promised lands are in simultaneous darkness when that happens. Because the one's already, I was on the other side of the earth, right? 2024 is another one coming up, and that's going to go right over the Hill Cumorah and some other interesting church history sites, and it's going to cross right in the middle of the country, right in this area. So last but not least, just about a month and a half or so ago, they had a secret meeting in California. Many of you may not even know that this happened, but this was actually a meeting that was called Beyond Resistance, Reclaiming Our Progressive Future. They were told very strictly not to allow anyone to have access to this information. Unfortunately, it got leaked for them. And so we have the agenda of the progressive movement has been shown at this meeting. We had people like John Stocks, who's now board chair of the National Education Association, the NEA, which we had somebody already talking about that. It was amazing. He's speaking at this conference. Also other people. They're talking about religious exemptions being taken away, climate control and progress on the age of denial. George Soros, who just committed $18 billion to progressive causes for this year, was there and speaking, and also other people like Nancy Pelosi. Bottom line, in closing here, there was a time in the Nephite history when they needed to have a reconnection with this covenant with God. Is it time for us to have such a connection? And that's what it said in this. It says, "Behold, whosoever will maintain this title upon the land, let them come forth in the strength of the Lord, and enter into a covenant that they will maintain their rights and their religion, that the Lord God may bless them." God wants to bless the covenant land. He wants that covenant land to bless all the other nations of the earth. We have a sacred responsibility to do that, and the only way we can do it is through living the Ten Commandments. So I'm hoping that we will do as in 2 Chronicles, where the Lord says, "If my people which are called by my name," who are the people who are called by his name? The Christians, right? "Shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land." I believe that the only way out of the situation that we're in is to turn our hearts and our minds and as many of our countrymen as we can back to God and Jesus Christ. I have this beautiful video, but it's a 4-minute video, so if we can't do it, we can't do it. But if we can, okay, all right.
After we have the closing prayer, if there's some that want, then you can show it to them.
Okay, that sounds good. That sounds great. Yep, absolutely. We need to let people out on time. So thank you so much for that. I want to thank Gail. Let's just hear it for Gail. What do you think? Is she amazing or what? It's been an absolutely wonderful conference. I've been so thrilled to be here and be a part of this.